The ballroom glittered with a ferocity that felt predatory. To Lady Alara Vance, each crystal dangling from the chandeliers was a sharp, accusatory eye. Each note from the string quartet a whispered judgment. She stood near a marble pillar, the cool stone, a welcome anchor in a sea of silks and jewels that threatened to drown her. This was the Marquess of Ashworth's annual ball, the glittering pinnacle of the season, and she had never felt more like an impostor. Her gown, a pale silver silk that had been her mother's pride 2 seasons ago, felt thin and inadequate beside the vibrant, fashion-forward creations swirling around her. It had been her family's last extravagance before the world had tilted on its axis, before the solicitor's letters began arriving like a flock of black-winged crows, each carrying a heavier burden of debt than the last. Her father, a man who loved books more than ledgers, had left behind a legacy of poetry and financial ruin. Now, the weight of their name, the fate of her younger sister's debut, the very roof over their heads at Vance Manor, rested on her slender shoulders. Her mother's instructions had been painfully clear, whispered behind a fan with the desperation of a general sending his last soldier into a hopeless battle. "You are a Vance, Ilara. Your breeding is impeccable. Hold your head high. You must secure a proposal. It is our only hope." Hope. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. The men who had once flocked to her side, charmed by her wit and quiet grace, now offered only polite, distant nods. News of a family's downfall travelled faster than any gossip, a stain that no amount of social poise could erase. She was no longer a prize, she was a liability. Her gaze swept the room, a painful catalogue of what she had lost. There was Lord Harrington, who had once written her a rather terrible sonnet, now laughing with the giggling heiress, Miss Albright, whose father owned half the shipping trade in London. She felt a pang, not of jealousy, but of a deep, weary sorrow for the girl she had been only a year ago, a girl who had believed in sonnets and the possibility of a love match. That girl was a ghost, and Ilara was merely the shell she had left behind. Then she saw him. He was not surrounded by a crowd, yet he was the undeniable centre of the room's gravity, Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood. His name alone was a litany of power, vast ancestral lands, mines, shipping interests, a fortune so immense it was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. He stood apart, speaking to no one, his presence a pocket of cold in the overheated ballroom. He was tall, dressed in immaculate, severe black, his dark hair untouched by powder. His face was a masterpiece of aristocratic planes and angles, so handsome it was almost forbidding. But it was his eyes that held the room captive, a glacial, piercing blue that seemed to see everything and value nothing. He was a widower, the gossips whispered. His young duchess, the beautiful Isabella, had died a few years prior, leaving him with a single heir. Since then, he had been a recluse, emerging only when duty absolutely demanded it. Tongues wagged about the cause of her death, a tragic, swift illness, but they wagged more furiously about the Duke's subsequent retreat from the world, his heart supposedly locked away with his late wife's memory. He was known as the Duke of Winter, a man carved from ice. Ilara shivered, turning away. He was a creature from another world, a world of untouchable power and unfathomable grief. He was not for the likes of her, a woman with nothing to offer but a tarnished name. She was a minnow in a sea of sharks, and he was the leviathan that ruled the deep. "He is looking this way," her mother, Lady Vance, hissed, appearing at her elbow as if by magic. Her fan beat a frantic rhythm against her palm. "Elara, for heaven's sake, do not look so funereal. Smile." Elara attempted a smile, but it felt like a crack in a porcelain mask. "Mother, he is not looking at me. He is likely looking at the Duchess of Leinster behind me." "Nonsense. He is looking directly at you. I saw it." Lady Vance's eyes were bright with a desperate, terrifying hope. "They say he needs a new duchess, a mother for the boy." The thought was so audacious, so impossible, that Elara felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in her throat. Her, the Duchess of Blackwood. It was a fairy tale in reverse. "Mother, please, we must be realistic." "Realism is a luxury we can no longer afford," her mother retorted, her voice sharp. "You will stand here, and you will look available." And so Elara stood, a silver statue by a marble pillar, feeling the weight of the Duke's intermittent, unreadable gaze like a physical touch. It was not a look of admiration or interest. It was one of appraisal, as if he were a connoisseur examining a painting for its composition and, perhaps, its flaws. She felt her cheeks burn, a flush of humiliation and defiance. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze for a brief, shattering second across the crowded room. His expression did not change. There was no flicker of warmth, no acknowledgement of her as a person. It was like looking into the heart of a winter storm. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone. The orchestra swelled, announcing the first waltz, the floor filled with couples, a kaleidoscope of colour and movement. Elara's heart sank. To be left standing, a wallflower during the first waltz, was a social death sentence. It was a public declaration of her irrelevance. She braced herself for the sting, for the pitying glances. But then, a path cleared. The whispers and laughter around her seemed to hush, the tide of the crowd parting. And through that sudden, silent corridor, he walked. The Duke of Blackwood. He moved with a languid, predatory grace that belied his size, his gaze fixed on her. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. He stopped before her, the cold emanating from him a palpable force. He was even taller up close, his shadow falling over her. The scent of winter air and clean linen clung to him, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the room. "Lady Elara," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of warmth as his eyes. It was not a question. She managed a small curtsy, her knees trembling slightly. "Your Grace." He extended a gloved hand. "You will grant me the honor of this waltz." It was not a request. It was a command, spoken with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Murmurs erupted around them like the rustling of dry leaves. This was more than an honor. It was a statement. The Duke of Winter, who had not danced in 3 years, was opening the ball. And he had chosen her, the ruined Lady Vance. Her mind reeled. She could feel her mother's triumphant gaze burning into her back. This was it. The impossible was happening. But as her fingers brushed his, the cold of his leather glove seemed to seep into her very bones. This was no fairy tale prince. This was a king from a land of snow and shadows. She placed her hand in his, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. "The honor is mine, Your Grace." As he led her onto the floor, Elara felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on them. They were not eyes of admiration, but of shock, envy, and sharp, calculating speculation. She was no longer invisible. She was now a curiosity, a puzzle to be solved. Why her? The question hung in the air, thick and heavy as unshed rain. The Duke's hand settled on her waist, firm and impersonal. His other hand held hers in a correct, formal grip. There was no gentle pressure, no hint of connection. It was like being held by a statue. The music began, a soaring, romantic melody that was a cruel mockery of the cold reality of her situation. They began to move, turning in time with the music. He was an expert dancer, guiding her effortlessly through the steps. Yet there was no joy in it, no life. He moved with a chilling precision, his body a perfectly calibrated machine. She was acutely aware of the rigid set of his shoulders, the unyielding line of his jaw. He did not look at her face, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if she were merely a necessary component in a tiresome social ritual. The silence between them stretched, becoming more profound than the music that surrounded them. Ilara's mind raced. Was she supposed to make conversation, compliment the music, the hostess? Every social grace she had ever learned seemed to evaporate under the chilling weight of his presence. She felt small and utterly inconsequential. "You are surprised, my lady," he stated, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it over the violins. Her head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, he was looking directly at her. The blue of his irises was startling, a deep, arctic cold that seemed to pull the warmth from her. I am honored, Your Grace," she stammered, falling back on polite convention. A flicker of something, impatience, disdain, crossed his features. Surprise is a more honest emotion than honor. Do not trouble yourself with platitudes. I have no use for them. The bluntness of his words struck her like a physical blow. She felt her back stiffen. All her life, she had been trained in the art of pleasantries, the delicate dance of social discourse. He had just swept it all aside with a single, cutting sentence. "Very well, Your Grace," she replied, a spark of her old fire igniting within her. "I am surprised. In fact, I am astonished, as I believe is the rest of the ton." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. It was not a smile, not even close, but the corner of his mouth tightened, a minute acknowledgement of her retort. The ton is easily astonished. It is their primary occupation. They continued to turn, a silent island in the swirling river of the Waltz. He was assessing her, she realized. This was not a dance. It was an interview. He was looking for something, and she had no idea what it was. She felt a desperate need to prove what? That she was more than just a desperate noblewoman with a pretty face. That she had a mind, a will of her own. "Your family has fallen on difficult times," he said, another statement of fact, delivered without a trace of pity. It was brutal in its directness. The humiliation was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a shard of ice to her heart. He knew. Of course, he knew. A man like him would know everything. He had sought her out, not in spite of her ruin, but because of it. She was vulnerable, malleable, a blank slate upon which he could write his own terms. "We have," she said, her voice tight but level. She would not cry. She would not show him the weakness he so clearly expected. She met his gaze, holding it, refusing to be cowed. "My father was a better poet than he was an investor." "So I have been led to believe," he replied, his gaze unwavering. He valued beauty over practicality, a common and often fatal flaw. The music swelled to its crescendo, the final notes hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. They came to a stop. For a beat, he did not release her. His hand remained at her waist, his eyes locked on hers. In their frozen depths, she saw not cruelty, but a vast, desolate emptiness. It was the look of a man who had not only closed a door on his heart, but had bricked it up and thrown away the key. Then he released her, stepping back. He gave a short, formal bow. "My lady," and without another word, he turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd as abruptly as he had emerged, leaving her standing alone in the center of the floor. The spell was broken. The whispers erupted anew, louder this time, a frantic buzzing of speculation. Elara felt dizzy, her hands still tingling with the phantom sensation of his cold, impersonal touch. She made her way back to the edge of the room on unsteady legs, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a cold, dawning dread. That had not been a prelude to a courtship. It had been a summons, a warning. The Duke of Winter had marked her, and she had the terrible feeling that her life, the one she had known, was now over. The chill she had felt in his presence had nothing to do with the night air. It was the shadow of her own future, stretching out long and cold before her. The next day dawned grey and oppressive, the London sky a blanket of damp wool. A footman from Blackwood House arrived before noon, bearing not a bouquet of flowers or a hopeful note, but a single crisp envelope sealed with a severe black wax signet, a wolf's head, stark and unadorned. Elara's mother snatched it from the silver tray, her hands trembling with a mixture of avarice and awe. The note was addressed to her father's younger brother, her uncle Theodore, who had, by default, become the head of their beleaguered family. The message within was brief and devoid of any romantic sentiment. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, requested a private meeting with Lord Vance at his earliest convenience to discuss a matter of mutual interest. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at the Duke's London residence. Uncle Theodore, a man more accustomed to discussing the vintage of port than negotiating marriage settlements, was pale with anxiety. "What am I to say, Elara? The man could buy and sell us 100 times over. We have no position from which to bargain." "You are to say very little," Elara advised, her own heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "You are to listen. He holds all the cards. We must simply learn what game he intends to play." And so it was that Elara found herself 2 days after the ball, seated in a small, suffocatingly formal parlour in her own home, awaiting the verdict that would define the rest of her life. Her uncle had returned from his meeting with the Duke an hour prior, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. He had relayed the Duke's proposal in a stunned monotone. It was, as Elara had suspected, less a proposal of marriage and more a contract of employment. The Duke required a duchess. The title needed a bearer, his household a manager, and his son a mother figure. He had investigated Lady Elara's background and found her breeding, education, and public demeanour to be satisfactory. Her family's financial vulnerability, he had termed it, was not an obstacle, but rather a point of clarity. It ensured all parties understood the nature of the arrangement. In exchange for her hand, the Duke would settle all of the Vance family's outstanding debts, every last one. He would provide a generous annual allowance for her mother and ensure her younger sister, Celia, would have a magnificent dowry, guaranteeing her a brilliant match. Vance Manor would be saved. Their name would be restored. The price for this salvation was Elara. There was one final condition. The Duke wished to speak with Elara herself, alone, to ensure she understood the terms before any formal announcements were made. He would be arriving within the hour. Now, Sitting in the fading afternoon light, she smoothed the skirt of her simple grey dress, her hands cold and clammy. This was it, the final sealing of her fate. She was not being wooed, she was being acquired. When the butler announced his arrival, her heart did not leap. It simply sank. He entered the room, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. He was dressed as he had been at the ball, in stark, immaculate black that absorbed the light. He dismissed her mother and uncle with a single, polite but non-negotiable glance, and they scurried from the room like frightened mice. The door clicked shut, and they were alone. The silence was absolute. "Lady Alara," he began, his voice the same low, emotionless baritone. He did not sit, but stood near the mantelpiece, one hand resting upon it. "I trust your uncle has conveyed the substance of my proposition." "He has, Your Grace." Her own voice sounded thin, a pale imitation of its usual strength. "And you have considered it?" "There is little to consider," she said, finding a sliver of her own resolve. "You have made my family an offer they cannot, in good conscience, refuse, and by extension, neither can I." He inclined his head, a minute gesture of acknowledgement. "Good. Pragmatism is a quality I value. It will serve you well at Blackwood." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, as cool and impersonal as his inspection at the ball. "I believe in clarity, my lady. It prevents future disappointments. I wish to be perfectly clear about the nature of the life you would be accepting. Our marriage will be a partnership, in name and duty only. I will be your husband, and you will be my duchess. You will have purview over the running of my households. You will act as hostess when society demands it. You will be a mother to my son, Leo." He pushed away from the mantelpiece and took a step closer. The air grew thick, heavy with his presence. "What I will not be," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming harder, "is a companion in the sentimental sense. You will have your own wing at Blackwood Manor, your own pursuits, your own life, so long as they do not bring scandal upon my name. I will expect you to afford me the same courtesy. My heart, my affections, my personal time, they are not part of this arrangement. They are not available to you or to anyone. Do you understand?" The words were like stones, each one landing with a heavy, bruising impact. He was promising her a life of gilded emptiness, a beautiful cage where she would be well kept and utterly alone. The final, flickering ember of girlish hope she hadn't even known she was still protecting. The hope for companionship, for a shared glance, for a single moment of warmth, was extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold ash. She thought of her mother's relieved face, of Celia's bright future, of the ancient stones of Vance Manor safe from the creditor's grasp. She had no choice, but she would not be a weeping victim. She would meet his coldness with her own dignity. She rose from her chair, forcing herself to stand tall, to meet his glacial eyes without flinching. "I understand you perfectly, Your Grace. You require a duchess who will perform her duties with decorum and discretion, and who will expect nothing of you emotionally. A functional component in the machinery of your life." His eyes narrowed slightly, a sign that her words had registered, had perhaps struck closer to the mark than he liked. "An astute summary." "Then you may rest assured," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart felt as if it were shattering into 1,000 pieces. "I will be the duchess you require. I will manage your home, host your dinners, and be a mother to your son. And I will not trouble you with any expectation of affection. You will have your solitude. You have my word." He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. She did not look away. She felt as if she were forging a treaty on a barren, frozen battlefield. He was the victor, and she was the vanquished, but she would not surrender her pride. Finally, he gave another single, sharp nod. "Very well. It is settled then. I will have the solicitors draw up the papers. The wedding will be in 1 month. It will be a small, private affair." He turned to leave, his part in the transaction complete. He was at the door when she spoke again, the words leaving her before she could stop them. "Your Grace?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob, turning his head slightly. "Your son?" she said. "Leo. You say you wish for me to be a mother to him. What does that entail?" The question seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, a shadow of something other than coldness crossed his face. It was a flicker of profound, deep-seated pain, so fleeting she almost missed it. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar, icy mask. "It entails seeing to his education, his well-being, his social development," he said, his voice clipped. "His governess, Mrs. Gable, will apprise you of his routines. You are to be a figure of maternal stability in his life." He made it sound as if Leo were another household account to be managed, another duty to be performed. But in that brief, unguarded flicker of pain, Ilara had seen something more. A crack in the ice, a wound that had never healed. He did not wait for a reply. He simply opened the door and was gone, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more absolute than before. Ilara sank back into her chair, the borrowed strength draining out of her. She had saved her family. She had sold herself. She was to be the Duchess of Winter, the bride of a man made of stone, and the mother to a child she had never met. The chill in the room was no longer just his presence. It was the first day of the rest of her life. The month leading up to the wedding passed in a grey blur of legal papers and fittings for a trousseau that felt like a costume for a role she had not yet learned. The marriage was, as Alistair had decreed, a quiet affair. There were no joyous crowds, no grand pronouncements. It was held in the private chapel at Blackwood House in London, attended only by her mother, sister, and uncle, and a grim-faced solicitor who stood as the Duke's witness. Ilara wore a gown of heavy cream satin, elegant and severe. As she walked the short aisle on her uncle's arm, she did not feel like a bride. She felt like a figure in a somber historical painting, her fate preordained. Alistair stood at the altar, a towering, remote figure in dark grey. He looked not at her, but at the stained glass window behind the vicar, his expression unreadable. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was cold and brief. The ring itself was a heavy band of platinum, set with a single, flawless diamond that glittered with a cold, internal fire. It was beautiful, valuable, and utterly without sentiment. It felt less like a symbol of union and more like the seal on a contract. Their vows were exchanged in low, formal tones, the sacred words stripped of all their meaning, reduced to a legal formality. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alistair did not kiss her. He simply took her arm, his touch firm and proprietary, and led her from the chapel. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. The journey to Blackwood Manor, the Duke's primary country estate, was undertaken in near total silence. The carriage was opulent, the ride smooth, but the air inside was thick with unspoken things. Ilara sat opposite her new husband, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. and watched the rolling countryside fly by. She tried to feel something, apprehension, excitement, even fear, but all she felt was a profound and hollow numbness. Alistair read a book, its leather cover facing her, the title obscured. He did not speak a single word to her for over 3 hours. He turned the pages with methodical precision, his focus absolute. It was a clear and deliberate message. She was now part of his life, but not part of his world. As they passed through a set of imposing wrought-iron gates, flanked by stone wolves, the carriage began a long, winding ascent through a dense forest. The trees were ancient, their branches heavy and dark, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the afternoon sun. There was a sense of deep, brooding history to the land, a feeling of immense age and solitude. Then they broke through the trees, and she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a fortress of grey stone, sprawling across a rise of land with a kind of magnificent, melancholy grandeur. Towers and turrets rose against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but there was no warmth to it. It looked like a palace from a dark fairy tale, a place where a princess might be held captive. It was, she thought, with a pang of bitter irony, her new home. The carriage rolled to a stop on a gravel drive before a set of massive oak doors. As if on some invisible signal, the doors swung open and the household staff spilled out onto the steps, arranged in a perfect, intimidating line. At their head was a severe-looking woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies. Alistair stepped out of the carriage and turned to offer Elara his hand. The gesture was correct, but his eyes were distant. As she stepped onto the gravel, she felt the collective gaze of the staff upon her. They were assessing her, judging her, just as their master had. "Mrs. Davies," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is the Duchess. You will see to her needs." Mrs. Davies executed a stiff, perfect curtsy. "Your Grace." Her eyes, small and dark, flickered over Elara, taking in every detail of her dress, her posture, her expression. There was no welcome in them. "Annalise," the housekeeper called, and a young maid with wide, nervous eyes and a dusting of freckles across her nose stepped forward, bobbing a quick curtsy. "This is Annalise. She has been assigned as Her Grace's personal maid." Elara offered the girl a small, tentative smile, which only seemed to make her more nervous. "Annalise will show you to your rooms," Alistair stated, already turning away. "I have matters to attend to in my study." And with that, he strode into the house without a backward glance, leaving her on the steps with a line of silent strangers. The dismissal was as complete as it was public. He had delivered his new Duchess, and now his part was done. A cold knot of humiliation tightened in Elara's stomach. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned to the waiting staff. She was the Duchess now. She had to act the part. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I look forward to making your acquaintance properly tomorrow." She then turned to the terrified young maid. "Annalise, if you would lead the way." Annalise nearly jumped, then scurried forward, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, Your Grace. This way, Your Grace." Elara followed the maid into the cavernous entrance hall. The interior of the manor was as imposing as its exterior. The ceilings soared 2 stories high, adorned with dark, carved beams. Massive stone fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, dominated one wall, but the hearth was cold and black. Portraits of generations of Beaumonts stared down from the walls, their expressions stern and judgmental. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and something else, something like old grief. The entire house felt as if it were holding its breath. They ascended a grand, sweeping staircase, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Annalise led her down a long gallery, past more closed doors and disapproving ancestors, until they reached a set of double doors at the end of a corridor. "The Duchess's wing, Your Grace," Annalise whispered, as if afraid to speak at a normal volume. She opened the doors, and Elara stepped inside. It was not a room. It was a suite of apartments, larger than the entire ground floor of her family's London house. There was a spacious sitting room, decorated in shades of pale blue and cream, with a small fireplace where a low fire had been lit. Beyond that was a large, elegant bedroom, and through another door, a dressing room. The furniture was exquisite, the fabrics luxurious. It was a beautiful, perfect, and utterly impersonal space. It felt like a suite in a fine hotel, not a home. "His Grace's wing is on the other side of the house, across the main gallery," Annalise offered, her voice still a whisper. Separate wings. He had been quite literal. A chasm of polished wood and cold stone lay between them. "Thank you, Annalise," Elara said, trying to inject some warmth into her voice. "You've been very helpful." The girl looked up, surprised by the kindness. Shall I help you unpack, Your Grace, or draw you a bath?" "A bath would be wonderful," Elara said. "The unpacking can wait." While Annalise bustled about in the adjoining dressing room, Elara walked to one of the tall windows in the sitting room. It overlooked the vast, manicured lawns at the back of the manor. The grounds were immaculate, the hedges perfectly sculpted, the lawns like green velvet. But beyond the formal gardens, she saw it, a high stone wall, almost hidden by overgrown ivy, with a heavy wooden door set into it. Inside, she could just make out the tangled, chaotic shapes of what must have once been another garden. It was a patch of wildness and neglect in the midst of perfection. She stood there for a long time, watching the twilight bleed the color from the sky. The house was silent around her, a vast, sleeping beast. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She had a title, a fortune at her command, and a wing of a great house all to herself. And she had never, in her entire life, felt so profoundly and completely alone. Dinner was a silent, formal affair in a dining room that could have seated 50. They sat at opposite ends of a long, gleaming mahogany table, the distance between them a vast, unbridgeable expanse. Servants moved, like ghosts, placing and clearing dishes, their presence the only sound besides the clink of silver on porcelain. Alistair did not speak, his attention fixed on his food. Elara, her appetite gone, merely pushed the exquisite creations around her plate. She felt like an actress in a play where she was the only one who hadn't been given a script. After the meal, he rose. "I will be in the library. Good night, Your Grace." He used her title as a shield, a wall to keep her at a distance. "Good night, Your Grace," she replied automatically, watching his retreating back. She did not see him again for 2 days. She spent her time exploring her new domain, a lonely ghost in the magnificent, echoing halls. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, most of them shrouded in dust cloths, preserved in a state of suspended animation. The atmosphere was one of quiet, pervasive melancholy. The staff performed their duties with silent, unnerving efficiency, their faces closed and wary. They answered her questions politely, but offered no warmth, no conversation. They were his people, loyal to the memory of their first duchess and suspicious of the new one. It was on the third day that she finally saw the boy. She was in the morning room trying to read when she saw a small figure out on the lawn, accompanied by a stern-looking woman in a dark dress. It was Leo. He was a small, slight child, with his father's dark hair but none of his imposing stature. From this distance, he looked fragile. He was throwing a ball for a large, placid dog, but his movements were listless, without any of the boisterous energy she associated with young boys. The woman, who must be the governess Mrs. Gable, watched him with a hawk-like intensity. Ilara's heart went out to him. This lonely little boy was now her charge, her responsibility. He was the one part of her contract that was not about duty, but about humanity. She watched until they went back inside, a strange ache in her chest. Later that afternoon, she sought out Mrs. Davies. "Mrs. Davies," she began, finding the housekeeper in the linen room, overseeing the folding of sheets with military precision. "I would like to be introduced to my son, Leo." She stumbled over the words, "my son." They felt foreign, a lie in her mouth. Mrs. Davies's lips thinned. "Master Leo follows a strict routine, Your Grace. It is not wise to disrupt it." "I have no intention of disrupting it," Ilara said, keeping her voice even. "I merely wish to meet him. The Duke himself said I am to be a mother to him. That will be rather difficult if I am not permitted to speak to him." The housekeeper's expression was stony. "Mrs. Gable, the governess, oversees all of Master Leo's activities. He is a sensitive child. He is still grieving his mother." The implication was clear. Ilara was an intruder, a disruption to that sacred grief. "I am aware of that," Ilara said softly. I am not trying to replace his mother. I would simply like to know him." There was a long, tense silence. Mrs. Davies seemed to be weighing her new mistress, testing her resolve. Finally, she gave a stiff, reluctant nod. "Very well, Your Grace. I will inform Mrs. Gable that you wish to join them in the schoolroom for his lessons tomorrow morning." It was not the warm welcome she had hoped for, but it was a start. As Ilara walked away, she felt the first flicker of purpose she had known since arriving at Blackwood. The house was cold, her husband a stranger. But the boy was a reason, a small, fragile reason to try. She began to notice the small cracks in her husband's icy facade. A moment at dinner when his eyes would drift to the empty chair beside him, a flicker of something that looked like pain before his expression shuttered again. A deep sigh of weariness she overheard from the hallway as he emerged from his study late one night, and his relationship with his son. He never saw the boy. He never asked after him. It was as if Leo's existence was a wound he could not bear to touch. The house was not just haunted by the memory of Isabella. It was frozen by it, and Alistair and his son were the epicenters of the frost. Ilara was living in a mausoleum, not a home, and she was beginning to understand that if any warmth were to ever enter this place, it would have to come from her. The schoolroom was on the second floor, a large, airy room with a view of the rolling hills. It was meticulously organized, filled with books, maps, and scientific instruments. But like the rest of the house, it lacked any sense of joy or childish chaos. Mrs. Gable, the governess, was as severe as her reputation suggested. A tall, angular woman with pale eyes, she greeted Ilara with a curt nod that was more dismissal than welcome. "Your Grace." Leo was seated at a small desk, his back ramrod straight. He did not look up when Ilara entered. He was a miniature version of his father, the same dark hair, the same serious set to his small shoulders. "Good morning, Leo," Ilara said softly, her voice sounding overly loud in the quiet room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible flinch, but did not respond. Mrs. Gable shot Ilara a look that clearly said, "See, you are a disturbance." "We are studying Latin declensions, Your Grace," the governess said stiffly. "It requires a great deal of concentration." Ilara felt like an intruder at a secret rite. She took a seat in a chair near the wall, determined to be as unobtrusive as possible. For an hour, she sat in silence, watching Mrs. Gable drill the small boy on verb conjugations. Leo responded in a soft, robotic monotone, his eyes fixed on his book. He never made a mistake, but there was no spark of interest in his face, only a kind of grim determination. He was not learning, he was performing. Her heart ached for him. This was not an education, it was an exercise in discipline. There was no room for curiosity, for wonder, for the simple joy of discovery. The following day, she tried again. This time, they were studying geography. Leo was made to recite the major rivers of Europe. Again, he did so flawlessly, his voice a dull drone. After the lesson was over, and Mrs. Gable had, with a pointed glance at the clock, declared it time for Leo's constitutional, Ilara lingered. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "I wonder if we might add something to Leo's curriculum." The governess raised a skeptical eyebrow. His Grace approved the curriculum himself. It is designed to be rigorous. "I have no doubt of that," Ilara said, "but he is a little boy. Perhaps he might enjoy something less rigorous. Nature studies, perhaps, or even just reading a storybook that is not related to his lessons." "Master Leo does not have time for frivolities," Mrs. Gable stated flatly. "His father expects him to be prepared for Eton. We cannot afford to fall behind." "Reading a story is not a frivolity," Ilara countered, her patience wearing thin. "It builds imagination and empathy. Surely Eton values such things as well." Mrs. Gable's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. It was clear she saw Ilara as a soft-hearted, ignorant interloper, threatening her well-ordered domain. The conversation was over. Defeated but not deterred, Ilara changed her tactics. She could not force her way into the schoolroom, but the house and grounds were vast. She began to spend her afternoons walking, deliberately choosing paths where she might, by chance, encounter Leo and his governess on their daily, silent constitutionals. Her explorations led her again and again to the high stone wall she had seen from her window. The heavy oak door was locked, a large, rusty iron keyhole staring at her like a blind eye. The ivy was thick, the wood weathered. It was a place of deliberate neglect. One afternoon, she found an old gardener, a man named Silas, with a face as weathered as the manor's stone, trimming a hedge near the wall. "Silas," she began, approaching him slowly, "can you tell me what is behind this wall?" The old man stopped his work, his expression turning guarded. He touched the brim of his cap. "Your Grace, that be the old garden, the late Duchess's garden." "Isabella's garden?" Ilara asked softly. "Aye. Her Grace, she loved it something fierce. Made it herself, she did. Brought in plants from all over. It were a paradise, they said." His eyes grew distant, lost in memory, full of light and color. "Why is it locked now?" she asked. "It looks so forgotten. Silas's face closed up. He looked down at his shears. After she passed, His Grace gave the order. No one was to go in. The keys kept in his study. He let it go wild. He shook his head slowly. A shame. A terrible shame. Elara looked at the door, at the creeping ivy that was slowly consuming it. A garden left to die. A heart left to go cold. The symbolism was so potent it was almost painful. It was a physical manifestation of the grief that choked this house. An idea began to form in her mind, a quiet, reckless impulse. It was audacious. It was a direct challenge to the unspoken laws of Blackwood Manor. It was perfect. She would not be a ghost in this house. She would not be a silent, decorative duchess. She would bring something back to life. Feeling a surge of purpose that was almost exhilarating, she left the old gardener and went in search of a way to begin. She found a small, disused gardener's shed, hidden behind a row of yew trees. Inside, under a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, were old tools, a trowel, a pair of rusty hand shears, thick leather gloves. They were small, clearly made for a woman's hands. Isabella's tools. A shiver went through her as she picked them up. She could not get into the walled garden, not yet. But there were other parts of the grounds that had been allowed to grow sullen and unkempt. A small rose garden near the east terrace, its bushes choked with weeds, the blooms small and pale. That afternoon, she put on a simple cotton dress and, armed with Isabella's old tools, she went to work. She knelt in the dirt, her hands, so accustomed to embroidery needles, now pulling at stubborn thistles and tangled bindweed. It was hard, unfamiliar work. Her muscles ached, and she broke a nail, but it felt real. It was a tangible act in a life that had become an abstraction. She was not the Duchess of Blackwood, performing a duty. She was Elara, tending to a patch of neglected earth. She worked for hours until the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. When she finally stood up, her back aching, a small patch of ground around one of the rose bushes was clear. It was a tiny victory, but it was a start. As she gathered her tools, she glanced up at the house. In a high window of the west wing, Alistair's wing, she saw a dark silhouette. A man, standing and watching. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she knew it was him. He had been observing her. She did not know if he approved or disapproved, if he felt anything at all. But he had been watching, and for the first time she felt that perhaps she was not entirely invisible to him. Her quiet initiative with the roses did not go unnoticed. The next morning at breakfast, another silent, formal affair. Alistair spoke, his voice startling her. "The East Terrace roses have been tended to," he stated, not looking at her. It was an observation, not a question. "Yes," she replied, her heart giving a little jump. "They were being choked by weeds." "They were my late wife's," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was fond of that particular variety. Elara's breath caught. It was the first time he had mentioned Isabella to her directly, without the formal prefix of the late Duchess. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Was it a warning? A test? "They are beautiful bushes," she said carefully. "They deserve to be cared for." He said nothing more, returning his attention to the correspondence beside his plate. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. But it was a beginning, a crack in the suffocating silence. She continued her work in the rose garden every afternoon, weather permitting. The physical labor was a balm to her restless spirit. It gave her a sense of control, a small corner of this vast, cold estate that she could claim as her own. The staff watched her from a distance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. The new Duchess, in a plain dress, with dirt on her hands. It was unheard of. Her attempts to connect with Leo were less fruitful, but she was persistent. She learned from Annalise that the boy loved birds. One day, she found a small fallen branch and spent an evening painstakingly carving a crude but recognizable robin with a small penknife. The next morning, she left it on a stone bench along the path where Leo and Mrs. Gable took their walk. She watched from her window as they approached. Leo saw it. He stopped, his small face lit with curiosity. He reached out a tentative hand, but Mrs. Gable said something sharp, and he quickly drew it back, hurrying to catch up with her. Her heart sank. But later that day, when she walked the path herself, the little wooden bird was gone. A week later, she tried again. Knowing they would be in the library for his history lesson, she went in beforehand and left an illustrated book of Aesop's fables open on a low table, far from the imposing desk where he worked with his governess. It was a book from her own childhood, one she had brought with her from Vance Manor. She did not know if he saw it, if he was even allowed to look at it, but she kept trying, leaving these small silent offerings like a patient naturalist leaving food for a shy, wild creature. They were messages in a bottle, cast into the silent sea of his lonely childhood. Then came the breakthrough. It was a bright, crisp autumn afternoon. Elara was in the rose garden, carefully pruning a dead branch, when she heard a small sound behind her. She turned to see Leo standing a few feet away, alone. Mrs. Gable was nowhere in sight. He was clutching something in his hand. He stared at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. They were his father's eyes, but without the icy shield. In Leo's, she saw a deep, heartbreaking vulnerability. "Hello, Leo," she said softly, staying where she was, not wanting to frighten him away. He didn't answer, but he took a small step closer. He opened his hand. In his palm lay the little wooden robin she had carved. "You found it?" she said, her voice catching. He nodded, his eyes fixed on her face. He looked from her to the rosebush she had been tending. "Is that a gloire de Dijon?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elara was stunned. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her. She looked at the tag on the bush. "Yes, I believe it is." "It was Mamma's favorite," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "She said it smelled like apricots." The simple, childish observation struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. This small boy carried the memory of his mother's favorite scent. The grief in this house was not just Alistair's, it was Leo's too, a burden far too heavy for his small shoulders. "She had very good taste," Elara said gently. "It's a beautiful rose." He looked at the ground, shuffling his feet. "Mrs. Gable says I'm not to bother you." "You are not bothering me at all, Leo," she said, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective warmth. "In fact, I would be very happy for your company. I'm not much of a gardener. I could use an expert's advice." A tiny, fleeting smile touched his lips. It was like seeing the sun break through the clouds for the first time in an age. Mama was the expert. "Well then," Elara said, offering him a genuine smile of her own. "Perhaps you can teach me what she taught you." He did not answer, but he did not run away. He stayed, watching her as she worked, the little wooden bird still held tight in his hand. It was a fragile truce, a tentative first step onto a bridge he had built between them. Their quiet companionship in the garden became a regular, unspoken appointment. He would appear in the afternoons, sometimes with Mrs. Gable watching from a stern distance, sometimes, miraculously, alone. He would not say much, but he would point out plants his mother had loved, or ask a quiet question about a beetle he'd found. Elara, in turn, would tell him the names of the weeds she was pulling, or read a short passage from her book of fables. They were building a world of their own, a small pocket of warmth and life in the cold expanse of Blackwood. One late afternoon, the air was growing cool, a harbinger of the coming winter. Elara was showing Leo how to gently loosen the soil around the base of a rose bush. He was kneeling in the dirt beside her, his small face serious with concentration as he copied her movements with a small trowel she had found for him. He let out a small gasp of delight as he uncovered a fat earthworm. He picked it up gently, watching it wriggle on his palm. For the first time since she had met him, he laughed, a real, spontaneous peal of childish laughter. The sound was so unexpected, so pure, that Elara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Your Grace," the voice came from behind them, low and familiar. Alistair. Elara's head snapped up. He was standing at the edge of the terrace, not 10 feet away. He must have come from the library, whose long windows overlooked this very spot. She had no idea how long he had been standing there. His face was in shadow, his expression impossible to read. Leo froze, the laughter dying on his lips. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of fear. He dropped the worm and scrambled to his feet, wiping his dirty hands on his trousers. "Father," he whispered, his eyes downcast. Elara's heart clenched. The easy, natural joy of a moment before had been shattered by his father's mere presence. She rose slowly, placing a reassuring hand on Leo's shoulder. Alistair did not move. He did not look at Elara. His gaze was fixed on his son. He stared at the boy, at his dirt-streaked face and grubby hands, and for a long, terrible moment, Elara expected an eruption of anger. She expected him to reprimand the boy for his state, to reprimand her for allowing it. But the anger never came. Instead, an extraordinary series of emotions flickered across the Duke's guarded features, too quick for her to name, but powerful enough to witness. She saw surprise, confusion, and then, unmistakably, a flash of raw, agonizing pain. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. He was not looking at Leo, the boy covered in dirt. He was looking at Leo, the boy who had just laughed, and it was tearing him apart. He took a half-step forward, his hand slightly raised, as if he meant to reach out. But then he stopped, his hand falling back to his side. The mask of cold indifference slammed back into place, but Elara had seen what was beneath it. She had seen the wound. "The gloire de Dijon," he said, his voice strained, almost rough. He gestured with his chin toward the bush they had been tending. Isabella believed it was the only rose that truly captured the color of a summer dawn. He turned, without another word, and strode back into the house, the library's French doors closing behind him with a quiet, definitive click. He had left them alone in the twilight, but the space was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of what had just happened. He had seen his son happy. He had spoken his wife's name, and he had revealed, in that one brief, unguarded moment, the depth of the chasm that separated him from his own child. The ice had not just cracked, a large, jagged piece had broken away, revealing the turbulent, dark water beneath. Elara looked down at the small, trembling boy beside her and knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her quiet life at Blackwood was about to become much more complicated. The fragile peace of Ilara's new routine was shattered by the arrival of a carriage 2 weeks later. It was an ostentatious vehicle, lacquered in a deep, glossy black, with a gaudy crest emblazoned on the door. From it emerged a woman who seemed to be the very embodiment of the carriage's style. Lady Isolde Beaumont, Alistair's first cousin. Ilara had heard of her, of course. The London gossips had once whispered that Isolde, a widow of some years, had fully expected to be the second Duchess of Blackwood. She was beautiful, in a sharp, predatory way, with dark, knowing eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently poised on the edge of a sneer. She swept into the entrance hall of Blackwood Manor as if she owned it, her silks rustling, her jewels glittering. "Alistair, darling," she cried, her voice carrying through the cavernous space. "You've been hiding yourself away for far too long. I've come to rescue you from this provincial gloom." She barely glanced at Ilara, who had been summoned by Mrs. Davies to greet the unexpected guest. Isolde's eyes swept over her, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in Ilara's simple morning dress and catalogued it as inadequate. Alistair emerged from his study, his expression thunderous. It was clear this visit was not at his invitation. "Isolde," he said, his voice clipped. "This is an unwelcome surprise." "Nonsense," she trilled, gliding forward to plant a kiss on his rigid cheek. "Family need not stand on ceremony. And this," she said, finally turning her full attention to Ilara, "must be the new little Duchess. How quaint." The condescension was so thick, Ilara could have cut it with a knife. She felt a flush of anger, but kept her composure, offering a polite, cool nod. "Lady Isolde, welcome to Blackwood." "Oh, I know Blackwood far better than you ever will, my dear," Isolde replied, her smile sharp as glass. "I practically grew up in these halls. Poor dear Isabella and I were inseparable." She sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. "This house holds so many memories." It was a declaration of ownership, a clear and immediate challenge. Isolde was staking her claim, not to the house itself, but to its history, its grief, and by extension, its master. Ilara was the usurper, the outsider. The days that followed were a trial of 1,000 tiny cuts. Isolde was a master of the subtle insult, the backhanded compliment, the public undermining. At dinner, she would regale Alistair with stories of his past, of parties and hunts and shared moments with Isabella, all designed to exclude Ilara, to remind her that she was a newcomer with no place in their shared history. "Do you remember, Alistair?" she would say. "That summer, Isabella decided to plant the blue poppies. She was so determined. Of course, they were a disaster, but we laughed about it for weeks." Alistair would say nothing, his face a stony mask, but the barb would find its mark, creating a wall of memory that Ilara could not penetrate. Isolde's most potent weapon, however, was Leo. She immediately insinuated herself into the boy's life, showering him with expensive, inappropriate gifts, a silver-handled riding crop, a miniature sword, and filling his head with stories of his angel mother. "Your mother was the most beautiful woman in England," she told him one afternoon, finding him with Ilara in the now thriving Rose Garden. Her eyes flickered to Ilara, a silent, vicious comparison. She floated through these gardens like a queen. This was her sanctuary. Ilara saw Leo flinch, his newfound ease in the garden, evaporating under Isolde's poisonous nostalgia. "We are simply enjoying the sunshine, Lady Isolde," Elara said, her voice level. "Of course you are," Isolde purred, turning her venomous smile on Elara. "It's so commendable of you to take an interest. But you must understand, for Leo, this garden is sacred ground. Seeing someone else here, well, it must be so confusing for the poor dear, like seeing a stranger in his mother's clothes." The cruelty of the remark was breathtaking. It was designed to wound both Elara and the child in a single stroke. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, Leo dropped his trowel and ran from the garden, his small shoulders shaking. Elara's heart broke for him. She turned on Isolde, her eyes blazing with a cold fury. "That was a wicked thing to say." Isolde merely shrugged, examining her fingernails. "Was it? I thought it was rather astute. The boy needs to be protected from unsuitable influences. He needs to remember who his mother was, not have her memory erased by a replacement." The battle lines were drawn. Isolde was not just trying to drive a wedge between Elara and Alistair. She was actively trying to destroy the fragile bond Elara had so patiently built with Leo. The boy began to withdraw. He no longer sought her out in the afternoons. When she saw him in the halls, he would avert his eyes and hurry away. The light she had worked so hard to coax into his eyes had been extinguished. Mrs. Gable, clearly allied with Isolde, became even more of a gatekeeper, citing Leo's delicate emotional state as a reason to keep him isolated in the schoolroom. Elara felt a growing sense of desperation. The one bright spot in her lonely existence was being systematically destroyed. She considered appealing to Alistair, but hesitated. What could she say? That his cousin was being unkind. It sounded petty, childish. He had made it clear he wanted a life free of emotional entanglements. A feud between his wife and his cousin was exactly the kind of complication he abhorred. The situation came to a head a week later. Elara was passing the library when she heard raised voices from within, a rare occurrence in the silent house. One voice was Isolde's, high and insistent. The other was Alistair's, a low, dangerous rumble. Compelled by a force she couldn't name, Elara paused, pressing her ear closer to the heavy oak door. "It is for the boy's own good, Alistair," Isolde was saying. "She has him out there, digging in the dirt like a common labourer. She fills his head with peasant stories. She is erasing Isabella's memory, bit by bit. He needs to be reminded of his heritage, of his mother's grace and elegance, not taught to grovel in the mud." There was a long, tense silence. Elara held her breath. Then Alistair spoke, his voice lethally quiet. "What you call groveling in the mud, Isolde, is the first time I have heard my son laugh in 3 years." Elara's hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp. He had heard. He had noticed. "He was happy," Alistair continued, the quiet fury in his voice making the hairs on Elara's arms stand up. "For a moment, he was a little boy, not a living memorial. And you, with your poisonous nostalgia and your selfish manipulations, you have taken that from him. You have taken it from me." "Alistair, I was only thinking of you, of Isabella." Isolde's voice was now laced with panic. "Do not speak her name," Alistair snarled, the sound raw, visceral. "You are not fit to speak her name. You use her memory as a weapon, just as you use my son. You have always seen this family as a means to an end. Your end. When Isabella was alive, you were her shadow. After she died, you saw an opportunity. You thought my grief would make me pliable, that you could simply step into her place. That's not true. It is the truth, and you know it, he cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip. I tolerated your presence in this house out of a misplaced sense of family duty. That tolerance has now expired. The Duchess, Lady Elara, is my wife. She is the mother of my heir. Her efforts with Leo have brought more life into this house in 2 months than you have in 3 years of circling like a vulture. You have overstepped, Isolde, for the last time. There was another pause. Elara could almost feel the shock radiating through the door. You will be gone by morning, Alistair said, his voice flat and final. And you will not return to Blackwood until you are invited. I assure you, that invitation will not be forthcoming. Elara pulled back from the door, her heart pounding. She fled down the hall, back to the safety of her own wing, her mind reeling. He had defended her. Not just her, but her actions. He had seen what she was trying to do, and he had valued it. He had stood against his own family, against the suffocating cult of memory that Isolde perpetuated, and he had chosen her. It was not a declaration of love. It was not a moment of warmth. It was a strategic alliance, born of a shared concern for his son. But it was more than she had ever expected. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing her, his stranger wife, on the same side as himself. For the first time since her wedding day, Elara felt a flicker of something that was almost hope. The Duke of Winter had gone to battle for her. The ground beneath her feet, so unsteady for so long, had just become a little more solid. The aftermath of Isolde's banishment was a profound and immediate quiet. The oppressive atmosphere of intrigue lifted, leaving behind the familiar, melancholy silence of Blackwood. But it felt different now, cleaner, less threatening. The staff, having witnessed the swift and brutal dismissal of a powerful family member, looked at Elara with a new, grudging respect. She was not just a placeholder. She was the Duchess, and she had the Duke's backing. Alistair did not mention the confrontation. The morning after Isolde's departure, he was as remote and silent as ever at the breakfast table. But as he was leaving the room, he paused at the door. The key to the walled garden is on the mantelpiece in the library, he said, without turning to look at her. The lock is old. It may be stiff. Then he was gone. Elara sat frozen in her chair, the words echoing in the silent room. The key. He was giving her the key. It was an act of trust so profound, so far beyond anything she could have imagined, that it left her breathless. He was giving her access to the heart of the house's sorrow, to Isabella's private sanctuary. It was permission. It was an invitation. It was, in its own way, a plea. That afternoon, she went to the library. The room was empty, smelling of leather and old paper. And there it was, lying on the cold marble of the mantelpiece, a single, large, ornate iron key, dark with age. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. It was heavy, a tangible piece of the house's secret history. She found Leo sitting on the grand staircase, listlessly tracing the patterns in the carpet with his finger. Since Isolde's departure, he had been lost in a fog of confusion and guilt. "Leo," she said softly, kneeling beside him, "I have something to show you." She opened her hand and showed him the key. His eyes widened. "It's the key to Mama's garden," he whispered in awe. "Yes," she said, "your father wants us to open it." This was a small lie, an embellishment, but she felt it was a necessary one. He thought it was time for it to have visitors again. "Will you help me?" He nodded, a flicker of the old light returning to his eyes. He slipped his small hand into hers, and together they walked out into the crisp autumn air. The door was just as she remembered it, shrouded in ivy, the wood grey and weathered. The keyhole was clogged with rust and debris. It took all of Ilara's strength to insert the key, and even more to turn it. For a moment, she thought it was hopeless. But then, with a great, groaning shriek of protesting metal, the lock gave way. She and Leo pushed the heavy door open together. It swung inward, revealing the world that had been hidden for so long. It was chaos, a beautiful, heartbreaking chaos. What had once been a paradise was now a wild, tangled jungle. Weeds grew as high as her waist. Rose bushes, unpruned for years, had grown into monstrous, thorny thickets. A stone sundial in the center was almost completely consumed by ivy, and a small, elegant fountain was choked with dead leaves and stagnant water. But it was not dead. Life was everywhere, rampant and untamed. Hardy perennials had survived, pushing their way through the weeds. A climbing rose had scaled the entire length of one wall, its late-season blooms a shower of pale pink against the grey stone. Bees buzzed in a thicket of wild lavender. It was not a place of death. It was a place of wild, stubborn, desperate life. "It's a mess," Leo said, his voice small with disappointment. "No," Ilara said, looking around in wonder. "It's not a mess. It's a secret. It's just been sleeping. And we're going to wake it up." And so, their true work began. The restoration of Isabella's garden became their shared project, their sacred duty. Every afternoon, they worked side by side. Ilara would tackle the heavy work, clearing the dense patches of weeds, while Leo, with his child's sharp eyes, would identify the plants that were meant to be there, the ones his mother had planted. "That's lamb's ear," he would say, pointing to a patch of fuzzy grey leaves. "Mama said it was for stroking." They cleared the fountain, scrubbing the stone until it was clean, and Silas, the old gardener, now their willing co-conspirator, helped them get the water flowing again. The sound of trickling water returned to the garden, a gentle pulse of life. They cleared the ivy from the sundial, revealing the motto carved into its base, "Horas non numero nisi serenus." I count only the sunny hours. As they worked, the garden began to yield its secrets. They found stone markers with the names of plants half buried in the soil. They uncovered a winding path of flagstones hidden beneath a mat of weeds, and in a far, sheltered corner, beneath the branches of a weeping willow, they found a simple stoned bench. It was here, Silas later told her in a hushed voice, that the late Duchess had often been found, reading a book. It was the heart of the garden. Alistair never joined them, but Ilara would often look up from her work and see him watching from the library window, a silent, brooding sentinel. He said nothing of their progress, but his tacit approval was all the encouragement she needed. The work transformed not just the garden, but Leo. The haunted, listless look left his eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity of a healthy child. He was no longer a miniature adult, but a boy who was allowed to get dirty, to be excited, to be sad. One day, while clearing a thicket, they disturbed a wren's nest. Leo was distraught, thinking they had ruined it. Ilara showed him how the nest was old from the previous season, and explained how the wren would build a new one in the spring. It was a simple lesson in loss and renewal, played out on a small scale. As the first frosts of winter began to touch the land, their work in the garden slowed. But the transformation was remarkable. The paths were clear, the beds were weeded, and the structure of Isabella's design was visible once more. It was sleeping, yes, but it was ready for spring. The change in the garden was mirrored by a change in the house. A subtle thawing. Ilara, bolstered by her new sense of purpose, began to assert herself as Duchess. She had the dust cloths removed from the drawing room. She ordered flowers to be placed in the halls. She spoke with the cook about changing the menus, introducing simpler, family-style dishes to be served alongside the formal fare. The staff, seeing these changes were not challenged by the Duke, slowly began to relax. The house was beginning to breathe again. The fragile new peace was tested when Leo fell ill. It began as a simple cold, but it quickly deepened, his cough becoming harsh and his skin hot with fever. The doctor was summoned, a portly, serious man who diagnosed a severe inflammation of the lungs. He prescribed bed rest, steam, and careful watching. Ilara immediately took charge. She dismissed Mrs. Gable, whose fussing and grim pronouncements were only upsetting Leo further, and moved a cot into his room, determined to nurse him herself. Annalise, her loyal maid, helped her, keeping a steady supply of cool cloths and warm broth. Leo was miserable. He tossed and turned, his sleep troubled by feverish dreams. In his delirium, he would call out, his voice small and pathetic. "Mama, Mama, it's dark." Ilara's heart twisted with every cry. She would sponge his forehead, murmur soothing words, hold his small, hot hand until he quieted again. Alistair was a ghost. He did not enter the sick room. He would stand for hours in the doorway, a dark, silent figure, his face a mask of torment. He looked at his son, sick and calling for a mother who would never answer, and the guilt and pain radiating from him were a palpable force. Ilara could see the war raging within him, the desperate desire to go to his child, and the terrible, paralyzing fear that held him back. She understood now that he was not merely cold. He was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of causing more pain. Terrified that he was somehow poison to the people he should have loved most. On the third night, the crisis came. Leo's fever spiked, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. The doctor was sent for again, but he could do little more than shake his head and counsel patience. Ilara refused to leave Leo's side for a moment. She sat by his bed in the dim light of a single lamp, bathing his face, whispering stories he was too sick to hear, willing her own strength into his small, struggling body. Alistair remained at the door, a statue carved from grief. He did not speak, did not move. He just watched, his face etched with a pain so profound it was terrifying to behold. Sometime after midnight, as the house lay in a deep, anxious silence, the fever broke. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on Leo's brow. His breathing deepened, evening out. He fell into the first true, peaceful sleep he'd had in days. Relief washed over Ilara so powerfully, her knees felt weak. She sank into the armchair by the bed, utterly exhausted, her body humming with fatigue. Her hand was still holding Leo's, and she drifted into a light, dreamless doze. She didn't know how long she had been asleep when she felt a presence beside her. She opened her eyes. Alistair was kneeling by the armchair. He had finally crossed the threshold. His face, in the soft lamplight, was stripped bare of all its defenses. It was the face of a man who had been broken. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, silent, unchecked tears. He was looking at her, at her hand holding his son's. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice thick and raw with emotion. "We saved him," she corrected softly. "He is strong. He fought." Alistair shook his head, a terrible, shuddering sob escaping him. He buried his face in his hands. I couldn't even touch him. I was so afraid." He looked up at her, his eyes, those glacial blue eyes, now flooded with a desperate, drowning grief. "You don't understand," he choked out. "You see this house, this life. You see a man who has everything. But I am a failure. I have failed everyone I have ever loved." Ilara's heart went out to him. This was it, the breaking of the dam. She simply waited, her expression full of a quiet, patient compassion she did not know she possessed. "Isabella," he began, the name a wound on his lips. "She did not die of an illness, not a physical one." He took a ragged breath, the words torn from a place of deep, private agony. The melancholy. It was a sickness of the soul. She was so full of life, so bright. When we first married, this house, it rang with her laughter. The garden was her joy. She poured all her light into it. He stared into the middle distance, lost in the memory. But the light began to fade. After Leo was born, a shadow fell over her. A sadness I could not reach, could not understand. She would spend hours in the garden, but she wasn't tending it anymore. She was just sitting there, staring. The laughter stopped. She would smile, but it never reached her eyes. I tried to help. I brought in doctors from London, from Vienna. They had no name for it. They spoke of female hysteria, of a delicate constitution. They were useless. He clenched his fist, his knuckles white. I was useless. I was impatient. I was a young man, arrogant, used to solving problems. And this was a problem I could not solve. I grew frustrated. I thought if I just loved her enough, if I was strong enough, I could pull her out of it. But I was drowning with her. The brighter she had been, the darker the shadow she cast. He finally looked at Ilara, his gaze pleading for an understanding he clearly did not expect. "She took her own life, Ilara," he whispered, the secret finally spoken aloud, poisoning the air in the quiet room. "In the garden, on the stone bench under the willow tree. She used a bottle of laudanum from the doctor. She just went to sleep. I found her there at dawn. The note said she was sorry, that the darkness was too strong. A strangled sob escaped him, and I let the garden die. I locked it away, because every time I looked at it, I saw my own failure. I saw the joy I could not protect. And Leo." He looked at his sleeping son, his face a mask of pure anguish. "He looks so much like her. He has her light. And I was so terrified that my darkness, the same inadequacy that failed her, would extinguish him too. So I kept him at a distance. I encased him in tutors and rules, thinking I could protect him from the world, when I was really trying to protect him from me." He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched a lock of Leo's hair. It was the first time Ilara had ever seen him touch his son. "And then you came," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He looked at her, and for the first time he was not looking at the Duchess of Blackwood or a business arrangement. He was looking at her. "You came into this mausoleum, and you were not afraid of the ghosts. You were not afraid of the silence. You tended my dead wife's roses. You taught my son to laugh again. You sat in this room all night, holding his hand, while I stood in the doorway like a coward. You have more strength, more compassion in your little finger than I have in my entire being. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and profoundly vulnerable. He had not just opened a door to his past, he had torn the entire wall down, leaving the ruins of his heart exposed for her to see. Ilara felt no triumph, no sense of victory. All she felt was a wave of overwhelming compassion for this broken, grieving man who had hidden his pain behind a fortress of ice. She reached out her free hand and placed it over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her touch was gentle, a silent offering of comfort. "You are not a failure, Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. It felt natural, right? "You are a man who has suffered a terrible loss. You did what you thought was best to survive it, but you don't have to survive it alone anymore." He looked down at her hand, covering his, then back up at her face. The chasm between them, the vast, empty space on the dining table, the separate wings, the years of silence. It all collapsed in that single, shared look. He was no longer the Duke of Winter, and she was no longer the purchased bride. They were just a man and a woman, sitting in the quiet dark, connected by a sleeping child and a truth that had finally been spoken. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time since his wife had died, Alistair Beaumont allowed himself to be comforted. The great shuddering sobs that shook his body were not just tears of grief, but of a profound and soul-deep release, and Ilara held his hand, a steady anchor in his storm, and simply let him weep. The dawn that broke over Blackwood Manor was pale and watery, but it was a dawn nonetheless. The storm had passed, both in the sick room and in the heart of its master. Leo's sleep was deep and healing, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Alistair had eventually retreated, not to his own wing, but to a chair on the far side of the room, where he had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his proud, guarded face softened and vulnerable in repose. Ilara watched him, a strange and powerful mix of emotions stirring within her. The man she had married, the cold, remote Duke, had vanished, replaced by this grieving, broken man who had shown her his deepest wounds. The compassion she felt for him was vast, but tangled within it was something new, something more complex and unsettling, a deep, resonant tenderness. It was a dangerous feeling, one she was not prepared for. When Leo finally woke late that morning, his eyes were clear, the fever gone. The first thing he saw was his father, asleep in the chair. A small, confused frown creased his brow. Then he saw Ilara, awake and smiling at him. "You're better," she whispered, stroking his hair. He nodded, then looked back at his father. "Is he—" "He was worried about you," Ilara said simply. "He's been here all night." Just then, Alistair stirred, his eyes opening. They found Leo's, and for a moment, an awkward, uncertain silence filled the room. All the old patterns, the years of distance, hung between them. Then Alistair stood up and walked to the bed. He did not hesitate. He sat on the edge of the mattress and reached out, his hand resting gently on Leo's forehead, checking for any lingering heat. "How are you feeling, son?" he asked, his voice still rough from the night's emotions, but gentle. Leo stared at his father's hand, then up at his face, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. "I'm hungry," he said. Alistair let out a short, choked laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was genuine. "Good. That's very good." He looked at Ilara over the boy's head, his eyes conveying a gratitude so profound it needed no words. That moment marked the turning point. The ice, once shattered, did not refreeze. A fundamental shift had occurred in the emotional landscape of Blackwood. The change was not loud or dramatic. It was a series of small, quiet revolutions. Alistair began to join them for meals, not just physically, but in spirit. He would ask Leo about his day, listening with a quiet intensity as the boy chattered on about a book he was reading with Ilara or a particularly interesting beetle they had found. He began to look at Ilara, truly look at her, his gaze no longer distant but filled with a watchful, thoughtful curiosity. A few days after Leo was fully recovered, Alistair found Ilara in the walled garden. She was wrapping the more delicate rose bushes in burlap to protect them from the coming winter. He did not speak at first, simply stood beside her, watching her work. "You have done wonders here," he said finally, his voice low. "We have," she corrected gently, glancing at Leo, who was happily collecting brightly colored autumn leaves nearby. It was a beautiful garden to begin with. It just needed some attention. "Like many things in this house," he said, his gaze meeting hers. The confession of the other night lay between them, an acknowledged truth. "I have been a poor steward, Ilara, of this garden, of my son, of this marriage." "You were grieving," she said softly. "I was hiding," he countered. "And I have asked you to live in the shadows with me. That was not fair." He gestured to the bench under the willow tree, the place where he had found Isabella. "I haven't sat there since that day. I couldn't bear it." He took a deep breath. "Will you walk with me?" It was a request, not a command, a quiet invitation into the heart of his pain. She nodded, putting down her shears. They walked the winding stone path together, Leo running ahead of them, his laughter echoing in the crisp air. They stopped before the bench. "I used to think that to preserve her memory, I had to preserve the grief," he said, his voice thick with reflection. "I thought that if the pain lessened, it meant I was forgetting her, dishonoring her. So I locked it all down. The garden, my heart, my son's joy. I made this house a monument to my sorrow." He turned to her, his expression serious, his blue eyes clear and direct. "You have shown me that memory does not have to be a tomb. It can be a garden. It needs tending. It needs light and air to live. It can be a place of life, not just loss." He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His touch was not the cold, impersonal grip of their wedding day. His fingers were warm, his grasp firm but gentle, sending a jolt of startling warmth through her. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with a new, fragile intimacy. The wall between them had been breached, not just by his confession, but by this shared moment of quiet understanding. That evening, a storm rolled in, the wind howling around the stone manor and rain lashing against the windows. After a quiet dinner, Alistair did not retreat to his study. "Will you join me in the library?" he asked, his eyes holding hers across the table. "There is a fire." The invitation was simple, but it was charged with a new significance. It was a request for her company. "I would like that," she replied. The library, which had once felt like his private fortress, now seemed warm and welcoming. A large fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering golden light on the rows of books. He poured them both a small glass of brandy and motioned for her to take the armchair closest to the fire. He sat opposite her, the firelight playing over the sharp planes of his face, softening them. They spoke for hours. He asked her about her childhood, her family, her love of books. He listened, truly listened, his gaze never leaving her face. She, in turn, found herself speaking with a freedom she hadn't felt in years, sharing stories and thoughts she had long kept to herself. She discovered he had a dry, unexpected wit, a sharp intelligence that was not just academic, but deeply perceptive. He spoke of his own youth, of his travels, of his dreams for Blackwood before the tragedy. He was peeling back the layers, deliberately, showing her the man he had been, the man he might still be. As the storm raged outside, a cocoon of warmth and intimacy enveloped them. The air grew thick with unspoken feelings, with the magnetic pull that had been slowly, inexorably growing between them. The conversation eventually fell into a comfortable silence. They sat, watching the flames, acutely aware of each other. The space between their chairs seemed to shrink, to hum with a palpable energy. Alistair put down his glass and leaned forward, his expression intense. Ilara. Her name on his lips was a caress. She looked at him, her heart hammering in her chest. He reached across the space between them, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. "I have been a blind and selfish fool," he murmured, his voice husky. "I married you for convenience, for duty. I offered you a life of cold emptiness, and you responded by filling my home with warmth and life. I don't deserve you." "Alistair," she breathed, her own feelings a tangled, confusing mess. "No, let me say this," he insisted, his eyes searching hers. "I am not the man I was a month ago. I am not the man I was when I made my cold, cruel bargain with you. You have woken me up, and I find that I do not want a duchess. I do not want a partner in duty." He moved from his chair to kneel before hers, his hands framing her face. The gesture was one of such profound humility, such earnestness, that it stole her breath. "I want a wife," he whispered, his gaze burning into hers. "I want a partner. I want you, Ilara, if you would have me." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite convention or sudden passion. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of tentative hope, of a deep, soul-shaking connection that had been forged in shared sorrow and quiet compassion. It was gentle at first, a question, and, when she responded, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, it deepened, becoming a current of warmth that flowed between them, melting the last frozen remnants of their formal arrangement. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a new beginning. In the heart of the storm, by the light of the fire, the Duke of Winter was finally, truly coming home. In the weeks that followed, the entire world seemed to shift into a brighter key. The kiss in the library had not been a fleeting moment of emotional transference. It was a profound and permanent realignment of their relationship. The house, which had once been a place of shadows and silence, began to fill with the sounds of life. Leo's laughter became a common occurrence, echoing in the long galleries. The staff, taking their cue from their master's altered demeanour, became warmer, more open. Mrs. Davies was even seen to smile. Alistair was a man transformed. The icy mask was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that seemed to emanate from him. He smiled more, a slow, breathtaking unfolding of his features that still made Ilara's heart catch in her throat. He sought out her company constantly, no longer retreating to his study, but spending his evenings with her and Leo, reading aloud by the fire or simply talking. Their conversations were a voyage of discovery. They learned each other's minds, their histories, their small, secret hopes. He learned of her passion for history, and she of his deep knowledge of agriculture and estate management, a practical intelligence she found deeply attractive. They were no longer the Duke and his Duchess. They were Alistair and Ilara, two people building a bridge of intimacy, plank by plank. Their physical relationship evolved with a tender, patient grace. After that first kiss, there were other stolen moments. A hand on the small of her back as they walked through a doorway, his fingers lingering on hers as he passed her a book. A soft kiss on her temple as she worked at her desk. He was courting her, she realized, with a sense of wonder. He was wooing his own wife. He made it clear that he would not presume upon the physical rights their marriage afforded him. He moved out of his separate wing, taking a suite of rooms adjoining hers, but he was scrupulous about respecting her privacy, waiting for a signal from her that she was ready for more. He was giving her the courtship they never had, allowing her the choice that had been stolen from her by circumstance. And Ilara found herself, to her own astonishment, falling deeply and irrevocably in love. She was not in love with the powerful Duke of Blackwood, but with Alistair, the man who spoke of his late wife with a gentle, healing sadness instead of raw pain, the man who would get down on his hands and knees to help his son build a fort of cushions in the drawing room, the man whose eyes would soften with a deep, abiding warmth whenever he looked at her. One crisp December morning, he came to her sitting room with a gift. It was not a piece of jewelry or some other duchess-like accoutrement. It was a large, flat parcel wrapped in simple brown paper. "For you," he said, a boyish eagerness in his eyes she had never seen before. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a beautifully framed, hand-drawn plan. It was a design for a garden, intricate and detailed. It took her a moment to realize what she was looking at. It was the walled garden, but not as it was, or even as it had been. It was a new design, one that incorporated the strongest elements of Isabella's original plan, the sundial, the fountain, the willow bench, but blended them with new pathways, new flower beds, and a section dedicated to the wildflowers and hardy plants that Ilara herself had come to love. In the corner, in elegant script, were two names, the Isabella and Ilara Garden. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. It was the most thoughtful, most meaningful gift she had ever received. He was not asking her to live in Isabella's shadow. He was inviting her to share the light, to create something new and beautiful that honored the past while embracing the future. "It is a place of healing, Ilara," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Isabella brought it to life, and you resurrected it. It belongs to you both." She could not speak. She simply rose from her chair, walked to him, and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tightly, his arms a strong, safe harbor. "I love you, Alistair," she whispered against his coat, the words feeling like the most natural truth she had ever spoken. He stiffened for a moment, then his arms tightened around her almost painfully. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. His own eyes were bright with an unshed emotion. "I love you, Ilara," he said, his voice raw with a sincerity that shook her to her core. "I think I started falling in love with you the day I saw you kneeling in the dirt, tending to those roses, defying the gloom of this house with nothing but a pair of old gloves and your own stubborn will. I was too blind and broken to recognize it. I love your strength, your compassion, your quiet grace. You have not just brought life back to my home, you have brought it back to me." He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss full of all the words they had not yet said, all the love that had been growing in the quiet spaces between them. It was a kiss of homecoming, of declaration, of a future promised. "I made a bargain for a duchess," he murmured against her lips. "And in my foolishness, I was given the gift of a lifetime, my wife, my love." He drew back, his expression serious, though his eyes shone with adoration. "Our marriage began as a contract, an arrangement of convenience. I would ask you, now, to let it be something more. Let us begin again, Ilara, not as Duke and Duchess, but as husband and wife, in every sense of the word. Will you have me? Will you truly be my wife?" She looked into his eyes, the clear blue depths no longer glacial, but as warm and vast as a summer sky. She saw her future there, a future not of duty and loneliness, but of shared laughter, of partnership, of a love that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, and was all the stronger for it. "Yes," she breathed, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. "Oh yes, Alistair, always." He swept her up into his arms, his joyous laughter, a sound she now knew and cherished, filling the room. He carried her through the door that connected their suites, a threshold they had never crossed together. As he laid her gently on her bed, the winter sun streamed through the window, filling the room with a brilliant, hopeful light. The arrangement was over. Their life was just beginning. A year later, the walled garden was a riot of glorious, effervescent life. The design Alistair had given Ilara had been brought into being, a testament to a past honoured and a future embraced. Isabella's beloved Gloire de Dijon roses climbed a trellis next to the hardy, cheerful daisies that Ilara had insisted on planting. The fountain bubbled, its water sparkling in the sun. The sundial, polished and clear, faithfully counted only the sunny hours. And there were many. Ilara sat on the stone bench under the willow tree, a place no longer of sorrow but of peaceful contemplation. The gentle swell of her belly was prominent beneath her light summer dress, a happy, visible promise of the new life she carried. She watched as Leo, now a boisterous, confident 7-year-old, chased a butterfly across the lawn. He was no longer a small, haunted ghost, but a boy full of light and laughter. The garden gate creaked open and Alistair walked in. The transformation in him was still a source of quiet wonder to her. The severe, forbidding Duke of Winter was gone forever, replaced by this man whose face was relaxed and open, whose eyes were filled with a constant, gentle warmth, especially when they rested on her. He carried a small basket filled with the first ripe strawberries of the season. He came to the bench and sat beside her, handing her a particularly large, sweet-smelling berry. "A peace offering," he said, his mouth quirking into the smile she loved. For being late, the tenant on the North Farm had a dispute over a boundary line. Was it resolved? She asked, biting into the strawberry. Its sweetness burst on her tongue. "It was," he said, his arm sliding around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I find I have become a much better negotiator in the past year. It seems that listening is a more effective tool than giving orders." He kissed the top of her head. "A lesson I learned from a very wise woman." Leo, having abandoned his butterfly chase, came running over to them, his face flushed with exertion. "Father, look." He opened his grubby hand to reveal a ladybug. Alistair leaned down, examining the insect with mock seriousness. "A fine specimen, Leo. Very fine indeed." He looked from his son's bright, happy face to his wife's serene one, and the expression that settled on his features was one of profound, bone-deep contentment. He had it all. Not the fortune, not the title, not the land. Those were just possessions. He had a home filled with love, a son who was thriving, a wife who was his partner, his confidant, his heart. He had a life that had been resurrected from the ashes of grief, more beautiful and precious than he had ever thought possible. He reached out, his other hand coming to rest on Ilara's belly, a gesture of gentle possession and awe. "And how is our other little project coming along?" he murmured, his voice for her ears only. Growing restless, she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think he, or she, is eager to join the family." They sat there together, a perfect portrait of a family bathed in the warm, golden light of a summer afternoon. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor had not been banished. They had been laid to rest, their memory integrated into the living fabric of the house. The silence was no longer a symptom of sorrow, but a peaceful quiet, punctuated by the buzz of bees and the sound of a child's laughter. The Duke of Winter had finally let spring into his heart, and it had bloomed more magnificently than he could have ever dreamed. Dear listener, have you ever felt as though you were living in a house of locked rooms? Perhaps not a physical house, but a life constrained by past hurts, by unspoken griefs, or by the cold, practical arrangements we make just to get by. We've all been there, standing in the silent hallways of our own hearts, too afraid to turn the key on the doors that hold our deepest pains. Ilara's story reminds us of a profound and gentle truth. Sometimes the key to unlocking those rooms is not a grand gesture or a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, persistent act of compassion. She didn't arrive at Blackwood with a plan to heal a broken duke. She simply saw a neglected rosebush and decided to pull a weed. She saw a lonely child and carved him a small wooden bird. She didn't try to tear down the walls of his grief. She simply planted a seed of kindness in the barren soil and tended to it day after day, without any promise of a reward. And in doing so, she showed Alistair that a heart doesn't have to be a mausoleum for what has been lost. It can be a garden, one that honors the memories of the past while still allowing new life to grow. Healing isn't about erasing the scars. It's about allowing the sun to touch them again. So if you find yourself facing a locked door in your own life or in the life of someone you care about, remember the power of the small, quiet act. Pull one weed. Offer one moment of sincere, gentle attention. Read one story. You may find that these are the only keys we ever truly need to let the light back in, to waken what has been sleeping, and to discover a love that is all the more beautiful for having bloomed in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need a little reminder that even the longest winters eventually give way to spring. Your comments and likes are always deeply appreciated as they help these stories find their way to new listeners. Until next time.